So now moving on to fiber. And I realize that the figures on this is very small, but I'm going to explain how this graph has to be read, and then I'm going to comment on it. So what you see here in this three-dimensional graph is, here you have take-up. So take-up is the proportion of the homes that you have connected to the network that actually subscribe to the service. Here you have ARPU, the biggest here and the smallest here. And that is the revenue that each paying customer contributes to your coffers. And here you have how long it takes to pay back. Now, obviously, this is a very simplistic model. I'm not going to pretend this is in-depth economic analysis. But it teaches us a number of really interesting things. And by the way, the assumptions here, which are in euro and not in New Zealand dollar, but you can substitute one for the other if you like, are that it costs you 1,000 euros to connect each home, and that you're making 45% gross margin on the service, on the retail service. Okay? So what does this tell us? Well, you can clearly see that this curve here shows that having a high take-up is more important to payback than having a high ARPU. And by the way, there's not a lot of European operators that have 75 euros ARPU today. In fact, there's none. So 75 euros is a really big ARPU. So you need to have a high take-up, and that's more crucial to you than to have a high ARPU. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two is, if we look at operators that have had a regulatory holiday, we see that usually their take-up is around 20 and 25% of the network. They rarely go above that, or at least once they reach that stage, it grows very, very slowly. 25% take-up. This puts us around here, okay? So you're going to be in the yellow zone here, which is a payback of 10 to 15 years. Is that acceptable to any telco? I don't know if there's any telcos in the room, but I think the answer is no. They don't want payback in 10 to 15 years. And then comes the last issue. And the last issue is that, as we have said, it's a lot more economical to run a fiber network than it is to run a copper network. But that only happens if I can disconnect the copper. And in order to disconnect the copper, I need to get 100% of my customers on the fiber. In fact, you will see that at 100%, it pays back really quick, less than 5 years. So how are you going to get 100% if you're an incumbent telco? The only way you're going to do it is if you're not the only one selling services over that network. So very clearly, this argument that we keep hearing, which is, if I invest in this, I need to be the only one to reap the rewards, is nonsensical. The real argument is, if I invest in this, I need as many people as possible to market, innovate, and sell services over my network, because that's the only way it's going to pay back in a reasonable amount of time. Now, there's another argument somewhere in there. If we say that 10 to 15 years is unacceptable to a telco, if we say that 5 to 10 years is unacceptable to a telco, and most would say that their shareholders would not agree to an 8 or 9 year payback plan, then that raises the question, maybe telcos are not the right guys to deploy this. Or at least, maybe they should be looking at their infrastructure business, their network business, differently than the way they look at their service business. And I'm leaving these questions up in the air for now, but obviously they're pretty crucial. This morning we heard from Joost from KPN. I wanted to put up here a quote by the CEO of KPN 3 weeks ago. I'll read it for you, although I'm sure you've read it already, but in hindsight, KPN made a mistake back in 1996. We were not too enthusiastic to be forced to allow competitors on our old wireline network, and I would say that's an understatement. That turned out not to be very wise. If you allow all your competitors on your network, all services will run on your network, and that results in the lowest cost possible per service, which in turn attracts more customers for those services, so your network grows much faster. An open network is not charity from us. In the long run, it simply works best for everybody. And what he's not saying here, but is obviously evident to any incumbent, is that the power of the brand means that the incumbent is going to have a majority share of that market no matter what happens. So by growing the pie, you make the whole system more economical, but you still deserve a pretty large share of that for yourself. Unless you're really, really crappy, but you know. So, open access. It's actually pretty hard to define, and I'm going to do that in the next few slides. But first of all, I wanted to display all the models that I've come up with, that I've met, actually, you know, researching various operations around the world. What you see in green here is public money, public investment, public management. What you see in blue is private. And what's interesting is actually all models exist more or less no matter who's paying. So what we got here on the left, I guess I should insist on the 3 layers. So P is the passive layer, A is the active layer, and S is the services layer here. So what you have on the left is what I call the full municipal network, which is a vertically integrated public network. This is a model that I've only seen in the US, but I imagine there are other places where this might happen. Usually, when municipalities get into rolling out these networks, they don't necessarily think from day one, I'm going to provide services, but they find so little enthusiasm from service providers who feel cheated that they're deploying a network to actually provide services that they end up having to do it themselves. The second model, which is this one here, is a model where either a public body, a utility, or an operator deploy both the passive and the active, but then you have multiple service providers capable of offering services over that, which I guess is, in a way, the separated model that we see here and in the UK, although where exactly is the distinction between the passive and the active remains, I think, a question mark in these models. What I call passive open access, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I'm going to get back to it in a further slide, is a model where the passive is deployed either by public or private money, and then a multiplicity of players, can activate that. The municipal open access is what you find mostly in the Nordics in Europe, where the passive is leased for a long-term period to an active wholesaler who then provides access to various service providers. And then, of course, in the not-so-open models, you have the vertically integrated model, which is the traditional telco model. So what does this mean? Well, if you're looking at the passive access infrastructure, if you want to be in that play, you actually have to invest a lot of money. You have to invest money in ducts and poles, you have to invest money in dark fiber, and you have to pay for the fiber termination to every home. The lifetime of your investment is 25 years, and it's mostly a local game because you have to dig to put that in the ground. If you're on the active wholesale layer, you have to put in access and aggregation equipment, you have to have OSS, BSS, and you have to pay for CPEs. The lifetime of your investment was more like 5 years, and again, it's a relatively local game because it's tied to the network and you have to have a physical relationship of sorts with the customer. If you're on the service layer, your investment barrier is actually much lower. You have to invest in service platforms, probably in BSS, to provision your services and build them, but you don't have to invest all that much money. The lifetime of your investment is much shorter, and you can operate on a wider geographical basis because you're not physically tied to the network. And then what we tend to forget when we talk about open access is that internet access, assuming a net neutrality position, is a form of open access. And on the internet layer, your investment is even lower. The lifetime of your investment, again, is short, and your scope is potentially global because geography is more or less no longer an issue. We talked about peering this morning, so obviously there are a number of bottlenecks, but they're clearly not as complex to overcome.